The road south from Stagira was dry in late summer, and the dust it raised settled slowly in the still air behind a traveler moving at walking pace. Stagira was a small Greek colony on the northern coast of the Aegean, a physician's town, the kind of place where the harbor smelled of fish and pine resin, and the conversations at the market concerned the price of grain and the passage of trading ships rather than the nature of the soul. A boy who had grown up there would have grown up watching his father's hands, careful, methodical, unhurried hands that moved over a patient's body the way a good reader moves over a page, looking for what was actually there rather than what they hoped to find. Aristotle was 17 when he left that place. He walked south toward Athens because Plato's academy was in Athens, and the academy was the place in the Greek world where the largest questions were being asked by the most serious people asking them. The journey from Stagira to Athens was long, and the roads were not always good. Through Macedonia, through Thessaly, down through the rocky passes of central Greece, the landscape changed gradually from the rougher northern coast to the drier, more luminous country of Attica. The light in Attica in late summer has a particular quality, whitish and clear, flattening distances, making the edges of things sharp and the sky behind them very blue. Coming over the final ridge above Athens, a traveler in the 4th century would have seen the city spread below in the basin of the plain, the Acropolis rising at its center with the Parthenon catching the sun, the agora laid out in the middle distance, and around it the houses, workshops, stoas, and temples of a city that housed perhaps 30,000 citizens, and many times that number in total, a city that considered itself the center of the civilized world, and had some reason for doing so. There was nothing in Stagira, and very little on the road south, to prepare a 17-year-old for what Athens was. The noise alone, the density of bodies and conversation, the smell of the agora in the morning, with its stalls of fish and olives and wine and leather and bronze tools, all of it overlaid with the smell of the animals and the dust and the sharp particular smell of a city that generated more heat and activity than any town ever could. Aristotle would have made his way through this, carrying whatever he had brought from home, following whatever directions he had been given, until he found the road northwest, out of the city proper toward the academy's grounds, where the plane trees cast long shadows across the paths, and the buildings were quiet and set apart from the city's noise, and the people he encountered there were the people he would spend the next 20 years of his life among. The academy was not a school in the way that word usually carries. It was not a building with a door through which one passed to receive instruction and then left. It was a grove, a garden, a set of covered walkways, and open spaces where people gathered to think, to argue, to read and write and question, over days and years and decades, the accumulated weight of their shared attention, pressing on the same problems from generation to generation. Plato had established it nearly 40 years before Aristotle arrived. By the time the young man from Stagira walked in through its entrance, Plato was in his late 60s. Not old exactly, but settled. The large arguments of the Republic and the Symposium and the Phaedo already behind him, the man himself, carrying the authority of someone who has spent a very long time thinking about things that matter and has not been trivially wrong about them. It was into this space that Aristotle arrived and stayed for 20 years. 20 years is a long time to disagree with someone you admire, and Aristotle did admire Plato. There is no reason to doubt it, and some of the warmest language in his philosophical writing is reserved for gestures toward what his teacher had found and built. But the disagreement began early and never resolved itself, because it was not a disagreement about conclusions, but about where to begin. Plato believed that the truest things were the most abstract, that behind this particular beautiful face, behind this particular act of justice, there was a form, a pure intelligible structure, the beautiful itself, the just itself, that gave the particular thing whatever reality it had. The real ran from the abstract downward toward the concrete, and the philosopher's work was to ascend, to move away from the shadow world of sensory experience toward the pure light of the forms. Aristotle had grown up watching a physician's hands. He could not begin there. The disagreement was, in some ways, a disagreement about where to rest one's attention. Plato's eye moved upward and away from the specific thing. Aristotle's eye moved into it. This tree, he would want to say. Not tree in itself, not the form of the tree, but this particular oak standing on this particular hillside, with its specific arrangement of branches and its particular history of seasons. Observable, classifiable, present. This man, this act of courage. The real world of particular things was not a shadow cast by something purer. It was the proper place to begin, and perhaps the only place, thinking about how to live and what mattered. He sat in the academy's covered walkways across from an aging Plato and disagreed, politely, carefully, with growing certainty, year after year, not because he lacked respect, but because the physician's method, look at what is actually there, had been too deeply formed in him to set aside. No one who worked closely with Plato for 20 years walked away unchanged, and Aristotle did not. The sustained engagement with the theory of forms gave him something even in his rejection of it, a rigorous vocabulary, a set of philosophical problems, sharply enough formulated that they could be argued with, a standard of exactness and definition that would mark his own work for the rest of his life. He took from the academy its appetite for systematic inquiry and its willingness to sit with hard questions without reaching prematurely for comfortable answers. What he brought to that inheritance from Stagira, from his father's hands, from the long road south, and the 17-year-old's habit of noticing particular things, was the empirical impulse, the instinct to classify and observe and ground the general claim in the evidence of the specific case. And it was out of this combination, Platonic rigor and the physician's patient attention to the actual, that there eventually emerged, years later, the Nicomachean Ethics, which included within it the longest and most careful treatment of friendship that any philosopher in the ancient world produced. When Aristotle turned his full attention to the question of what it meant for two people to be genuinely bound to each other in goodwill and mutual care, he brought to it the same empirical method he brought to everything else. Not friendship as an ideal form floating above the messy world of actual human relationships, but friendship as it was actually practiced in Athens in the 4th century among people who had particular characters and particular histories and particular ways of treating each other over time. The real, the observable, the thing on which one could rest one's careful attention and find there more than one had expected. Athens, in this period, was a city in which the question of friendship was not an abstract one. The Greek word that is usually translated as friendship, philia, carried far more weight and covered far more ground than that translation suggests. Philia was the bond between parents and children, between siblings, between husband and wife. It was the tie between members of a trading partnership. It was what united comrades who had served in the same military campaigns, citizens who belonged to the same religious associations, men whose families had been bound together by generations of mutual obligation and shared history. Philia was what held a political community together from the inside, the invisible weave of mutual recognition and goodwill that made it possible for people to live in the same space and treat each other as more than obstacles or means. A city organized around philia was not a city in which everyone loved everyone else with equal warmth. It was something more nuanced and more durable than that. It was a city in which people saw each other, recognized one another's characters, knew one another's histories, could read in a greeting the entire accumulated weight of years of alliance and obligation, and shared trust and occasional disagreement that had been survived and not destroyed. The agora in the morning, with its noise and its commerce, and its arguments and its slow recognitions, was a space in which philia was not merely theorized, but lived. Citizens paused to greet one another by name. In each pause, in each name spoken, was embedded something that a stranger watching from the edge of the market could not fully read. A history, a relationship, a quality of regard that had been earned over time and was expressed now in a single exchanged look or a word of greeting or the particular way one man turned toward another. This visibility mattered. In 4th century Athens, the life of the free male citizen was organized around public participation in a way that made character legible, observable, subject to the judgment of one's fellow citizens in a continuous and inescapable way. Who a man called his friends was not a private matter, or not only a private matter, it was a statement about who he was. To be seen in close association with a man of bad character was to have said something about one's own. To be known as someone whose friendships were stable, whose goodwill was reliable, whose regard for his friends had proven itself over years of varied circumstance. This was not a supplement to one's civic standing, it was part of its substance. The ethical and the political were not separate regions of life, with a clear border between them. They ran together, and philia was one of the places where they ran most visibly together. Aristotle had been living in this city for more than 2 decades, when in 343 BCE he received an invitation that took him out of it. Philip of Macedon, king of the largest military power in the Greek world, asked him to come north to serve as tutor to his 13-year-old son, Alexander. Aristotle went. He was 40 at the time, and the move carried him away from Athens to the Macedonian court at Pella, a different world in almost every sense. Rougher, louder, shaped by military ambition and dynastic calculation rather than the civic discussions of the agora. The tutorship lasted 3 years, perhaps 4, before Alexander's public life began in earnest and the tutor became the king. What happened in those years is not entirely clear from the historical distance. There are stories, some of them plausible and some of them not, about what teacher and student read together, what they discussed, what Aristotle gave the young Alexander in terms of intellectual formation. Among the more durable of these stories is the one about the annotated copy of Homer's Iliad that Aristotle prepared for his student, a text marked and glossed in his own hand, which Alexander is said to have kept close for the rest of his life, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. Whether or not the detail is precisely true, what it points toward is something real, for a time at least. Teacher and student were united in the attention they brought to a story about excellence, loyalty, and the grief of losing someone who was, in every sense that mattered, another self. The Iliad is in many ways a poem about friendship, about Achilles and Patroclus, about what one man's life means to another, about the catastrophic cost of losing the person through whom your own life has most fully been understood. It is a strange coincidence, or not a coincidence at all, that Aristotle should have spent years with a text about this, while he was simultaneously, in the larger work of his philosophical life, developing the ideas that would give such bonds their most rigorous theoretical account. The later relationship between Aristotle and Alexander, as the former student became the man who dismantled the bounded polis that his teacher's entire philosophy assumed, is a thing that can be observed only from a great distance. There is no record of a decisive rupture, no dramatic moment in which the philosopher turned away from the king and said in so many words that empire was the enemy of genuine community. What there is instead is a philosophical system built over decades, refined across hundreds of pages of carefully organized argument, in which the claim recurs, quietly but persistently, that genuine human bonds require particularity, scale, recognizability, that the city must be small enough for citizens to know one another's characters, that the friend must be someone whose goodness one has actually observed over time, not an abstraction, not a distant excellences admired from afar, but a person who has been present and known and tested. These claims considered against the background of a student who went on to conquer most of the known world and envision a kind of human solidarity that dissolved the boundaries of the polis entirely, have the texture of a philosophical disagreement conducted not in argument, but in the respective directions two lives moved. Not a conflict, exactly, not a crisis, from the long distance at which it can be seen. More like two different understandings of what binds people together and what scale of community is capable of sustaining genuine care, playing themselves out in the respective works of a teacher and a student who had for a few years in Macedonia been genuinely close. When Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BCE, he did not return to the academy, which was now under other leadership. He founded instead his own school, in the gymnasium near the temple of Apollo Lykios on the eastern side of the city. The school took its name from the temple and became known as the Lyceum, and the style of teaching that took place there gave the people who did it a second name, Peripatetics, from the covered walkway, the Peripatos, along which Aristotle and his students walked and talked and thought together through the morning hours. The Lyceum was organized around collaborative research in a way that distinguished it from the academy and from most of the other philosophical schools of the ancient world. There were lectures, certainly, and there was a library, one of the first genuine research libraries in the Greek world, assembled with the systematic care of someone who believed that knowledge was cumulative, and that getting things right required knowing what had already been found and where it had fallen short. But the most characteristic activity of the Lyceum was not the lecture. It was the conversation that moved as its participants moved through the shaded paths of the gymnasium in the morning, one person speaking and others listening, and then speaking in turn, the thinking being done together rather than privately and then reported publicly. Biology and rhetoric and physics and ethics and politics, the range of subjects that Aristotle and his students addressed over the years of the school's operation, were not separate disciplines sealed off from each other. They were all aspects of a single, patient, empirical attention to the world as it actually was. What was being theorized in the ethics was being practiced in the garden, not perfectly. Nothing is ever practiced perfectly, but genuinely, in the ways that matter. The Lyceum was a community of people who had chosen to spend their time thinking together, who had gathered around a shared intellectual purpose, who knew each other's strengths and difficulties and characteristic ways of approaching a problem, who had over months and years of shared work come to understand something about what each person actually was, rather than merely what they seemed or wished to be. The bond among them was not identical to the virtue friendship that Aristotle was simultaneously writing about in the Ethics. It was, most of it, something more partial than that. The shared pleasure of intellectual work, the practical usefulness of collaborative inquiry, the affection that develops naturally among people who spend long hours together in conditions that are, on the whole, good. But in its best moments, in the walking conversations that were not strategic or performative, but simply honest thinking done together, it touched something closer to the thing Aristotle was trying to describe. There is something in this worth sitting with for a moment. A philosopher who is trying to understand what friendship is at its truest and deepest, building around himself a community of people engaged in the shared pursuit of understanding, the philosopher's life and the philosopher's thought, running alongside each other, neither one fully separate from the other. What one does in the morning with the students on the shaded path is part of what one writes in the afternoon about the conditions under which genuine human bonds become possible. And what one writes clarifies, gradually, what one is doing when one walks and talks with a student and finds that the student has noticed something one had not quite seen. The questions that drove the Lyceum's work were not, in the main, questions that had been answered before Aristotle arrived at them. Some of them have not been answered since, but among them the question of friendship occupied a particular place, partly because it was central to the larger project of understanding the good human life, and partly because it was a question that could not be answered from a comfortable distance. One had to have some experience of the thing, some history with it, some accumulated evidence drawn from actual lives, lived in actual community with actual people, before the question would yield anything more than a formal structure. Aristotle had this. 20 years in the academy, 3 or 4 years with a young king in Macedonia who slept with an annotated Homer under his pillow, 12 years in the Lyceum, walking the shaded paths in the morning with students whose characters he was coming to know, whose thinking was becoming in some cases something genuinely his own thinking extended and developed and sometimes corrected. The relationship between his philosophical account of friendship and his life is not tidy or conclusive. He was not living out a theory he had worked out in advance. He was, more likely, doing what the physician's method requires, observing, noticing, classifying, returning to the evidence with fresh attention, and finding in the material of his own experience some of the evidence he needed to make the argument more precisely. There is a particular light in Athens in the evening, after the heat of the day has passed, and before the dark settles in, when the sky over the Acropolis goes from blue to a pale green, and then to gold, and the stones of the agora hold the warmth of the afternoon in them, and release it slowly into the cooling air. In this light, the city has a quality of gathered stillness, as though all the day's motion and noise has settled like silt to the bottom, and only the clear water remains. People moving through the agora at this hour move more slowly. The conversations are quieter. The city, for an hour or so before the dark, is the kind of place where you might sit with someone you have known for many years and say very little, and feel that the saying of very little was entirely sufficient. Aristotle knew this city in all its lights. He had arrived in it as a 17-year-old from a northern colony, carrying a physician father's careful habits of observation, and he had lived in it, and left it, and returned to it through the most significant intellectual decades of the ancient world. He had known Plato and disagreed with him for 20 years without the disagreement becoming either silence or contempt. He had spent years in Macedonia with a student who went on to change the shape of the world in ways that his teacher's philosophy had no entirely comfortable place for. He had built a school organized around the practice of thinking together, and in building it had made, without perhaps fully intending to, a small demonstration of what he was arguing about in the texts. The Lyceum students walking the Peripatos in the early morning, moving through the shaded paths of the gymnasium with the day's questions still forming themselves in the air between them, were doing something that their teacher was simultaneously writing about in the most careful prose he had. The place where friendship was practiced, and the place where it was understood, in those years and in that garden, were close enough to each other that the distinction between them was not always easy to draw. Perhaps the whole point was that it should not be, that the best thinking about how to live and the actual living of it should inform each other, correct each other, move alongside each other through the same long mornings. The questions Aristotle was building his account of friendship to answer were not new to him by the time he wrote them down. They had been forming for decades in the academy and in Macedonia and in the Lyceum, in the long conversations and the patient observations and the returning attention to what was actually there. What is it for two people to be genuinely bound to each other in goodwill and mutual care? What distinguishes a bond that is real but partial from one that is complete? What does it mean to know someone's character rather than merely their surface? What does a community of friends, at its best, make possible that a collection of strangers held together only by law and shared geography cannot? These are questions that had been in the air of Athens for a long time, before Aristotle put them down in the systematic form they take in the Ethics. They were in the air of the Agora, when citizens paused to greet one another by name and read in the greeting an entire history of shared trust. They were in the air of the Academy, when a young man from Stagira sat in the covered walkways across from Plato and disagreed with him carefully, but without apology, because a physician's son had been taught that the honest observation mattered more than the comfortable conclusion. They were in the air of Macedonia, when teacher and student bent together over an annotated Iliad, and were briefly united in the attention they brought to a story about the grief of losing someone who was another self. By the time Aristotle sat down to write what he had found, he had been living with these questions for most of his adult life. He had not resolved them in the sense of having made them stop asking themselves, but he had accumulated around them a weight of careful thought and specific observation that gave his account a quality different from pure speculation, the quality of someone who had been watching the thing in question closely enough and long enough that what he said about it had the density of something genuinely seen. The students walking the Peripatos in the morning knew this, even if they could not have said it precisely. The philosopher walking with them was not talking about something he had thought of in the abstract. He was talking about something he had been inside of, observing from within for most of his life. And the walking itself, the thinking done together, in motion, through the shaded paths of a gymnasium in Athens in the morning, was part of what he was, slowly and without urgency, trying to understand. The place where friendship is practiced and the place where it is understood are, at their best, the same place. Not always, and not perfectly, and not without the ordinary difficulties of real human community, the misunderstandings and the partial knowledge, and the long stretches of time in which nothing very significant seems to be happening. But in those mornings on the Peripatos, in the conversations that moved between biology and rhetoric and ethics and back again, in the accumulated shared attention of people who had chosen to spend their time thinking together. In all of this, the account Aristotle was building and the life he was living were close enough together that neither one was quite complete without the other. The lamp had burned low by the time Aristotle set down his stylus and looked at what he had written. It was late in the day, that hour when the light in the Lyceum's covered walkways turns the color of old wood, and the city beyond the gymnasium walls falls into its particular evening quiet. A few students remained nearby, seated on stone benches with their own wax tablets, but none of them spoke. The papyrus before him carried the opening words of what would become the most sustained philosophical treatment of friendship the ancient world produced, and he sat with it for a moment in the way a person sits with something they know is not yet right, but is at last moving in a true direction. He had been circling the problem for years. And not because friendship was obscure, it was in many ways the most visible thing in Athenian life, the publicly legible bond that organized households, trading partnerships, civic loyalties, military alliances, and the intimacies of shared philosophy into a single Greek word, philia. The problem was that the word covered too much. It covered the warmth between a merchant and his regular customers. It covered the pull a young man feels toward the companion whose wit makes an evening feel lit from inside. It covered the deep and tested thing between two people who have known each other long enough to have seen each other fail and return and fail again and still remained. These were not the same thing, and yet they were all, in some recognizable way, the same kind of thing. So he wrote. And what he reached for first was not a definition, but a distinction, drawn not to dismiss any of these bonds, but to see them clearly. The first kind of friendship he had observed everywhere in the Agora, the market district where Athenian civic life organized itself around transaction. Two merchants meeting at a stall, one with olive oil from the south, one with cloth from the north, negotiate a trade arrangement with a courtesy that is genuine, a goodwill that is real and felt by both of them, and a warmth that colors the whole exchange. They know each other's names. They have sat together at the same table at a festival and shared wine and spoken of their families. There is something between them that neither would call cold, and neither would be wrong to call it friendship, because it contains at its surface nearly everything that friendship looks like from a distance: reliability, mutual benefit, the particular pleasure of dealing with someone whose word you trust because their word has always been good. Aristotle called this a friendship of utility. He meant nothing insulting by the name. He was describing what holds such a bond together, the practical benefit each person derives from the arrangement, and noting, with the careful honesty of a physician observing a patient, that what holds a thing together also determines what will dissolve it. When the merchant from the south finds a closer supplier, or when the arrangement becomes unfavorable to one party, the warmth cools naturally, without bitterness, without drama, simply because the conditions that produced it have changed. The goodwill was real, it was also conditional, and those two things can both be true at once. He associated this kind of friendship most commonly with older people and with those whose lives are organized around commerce and practical affairs, not as a criticism, but as an observation about what a life spent managing practical arrangements tends to produce. Older people, Aristotle thought, are less likely to live for pleasure and more likely to live for advantage, not because they are worse people, but because time has shaped them toward the useful and away from the merely enjoyable. Their friendships tend to follow the same pattern. They are sustained by an exchange of services, information, protection, resources, real goods, genuinely shared, and they are as durable as the exchange that sustains them, which is to say, durable enough for the purposes they serve. There is something quietly honest in Aristotle's treatment of these friendships. He did not rank them below the others, and then quietly ignore them as unworthy of attention. He looked at them directly, the way he looked at everything, the way his physician father had taught him to look, carefully, without flinching, at what was actually there. What he found was a form of friendship that is more common than any other, that organizes a very large portion of human social life, that contains genuine goodwill and genuine recognition, and that is, for all that, held together by something other than the persons themselves. The affection in a friendship of utility attaches not to the friend as a person, in their full particularity, but to the friend as the source of something useful. When the source dries up, the affection has nowhere to go. This is not a failure of character, it is simply the structure of the bond, the second kind he knew from the young men of Athens, and from his own memory of having been one of them. There is a particular quality to the friendships formed in youth, a brightness and an ease that older forms of friendship rarely match. Aristotle had watched his students arrive at the Lyceum at 17 and 18, already half in love with one another, before they had learned each other's philosophical positions, drawn together by the pleasure of each other's presence, the wit of one, the vitality of another, the way a particular person's laugh could make an entire room feel more alive. This is not a shallow thing. The pleasure is genuine. The affection is genuine. The sense of being understood, of being wanted in a particular person's company, is among the most vivid experiences a life can contain. Friendships of pleasure, Aristotle wrote, are grounded in the enjoyment each person derives from the other's company, not from any practical advantage, not from any deep and tested knowledge of character, but from the simple, irreducible fact that being with this person makes the hours feel worth living. He associated these friendships most with the young, and he did so with something that reads less like judgment than like recognition, the recognition of someone who had thought carefully about what it means to live according to feeling rather than settled disposition. The young, in Aristotle's account, live by passion and response. Their preferences change as they change. Their tastes shift as they encounter more of the world. And their friendships, grounded as they are in the enjoyment of what is vivid and pleasurable right now, shift with them. There is a kindness in the way he writes about this. A group of young Athenians gathering in the evening around someone whose presence makes the hours feel lit from inside. The storyteller, the wit, the one whose energy seems to draw the rest into a better version of themselves for the duration of the evening. The affection in that room is genuine and generous. It passes between people freely, and it asks nothing heavier than continued presence, and it will change. When the person at the center moves to another city, or when tastes evolve, or when the particular pleasure that held the group together shifts into something that no longer fits the people they are becoming, the friendship will change with it. Without bitterness in many cases, and without any sense of failure, just the natural movement of people who were held together by something particular and temporary toward whatever comes next. Aristotle observed this without sorrow. The brevity of pleasure friendship was not to him a defect in the bond, but simply the truth of its structure. Something that is held together by pleasure will last as long as the pleasure does, and this is neither good nor bad, but only what such a friendship is. What he was reaching toward, with both of these careful observations, was a kind of philosophical precision that is in some ways the opposite of judgment. He was not saying that these friendships are worthless. He was not even saying they are lesser, in the way that a lesser thing is a failed version of a better thing. He was saying that they are partial. They contain something real. They contain genuine goodwill, genuine affection, genuine mutual recognition. But what they contain is organized around something other than the persons themselves, which means they are not yet complete. The distinction mattered because he believed that friendship was not merely a pleasant feature of a human life, but one of its necessary structures, something without which a person could not flourish in the fullest sense. And if that was true, then the kind of friendship that serves as a foundation for a life had to be a friendship that does not dissolve when circumstances change, because circumstances always change. It had to be a friendship whose roots go deep enough to hold when everything else shifts. Late in the afternoon, as the light changed and the walkways of the Lyceum grew warm with the long horizontal quality that Athenian light takes on in the final hours of the day, Aristotle must have paused with what he was thinking. The students nearby had grown quieter. The sounds of the city, the distant clatter of the agora, the occasional voice of someone calling across the gymnasium grounds had softened, and he was working toward the third kind, the one he called teleophilia, complete or perfect friendship, which he would argue is not just a better version of the other two, but something different in kind. Complete friendship. Teleophilia is the relationship between people of matched virtue who love each other not for what they provide and not for how they make the hours feel, but for what each genuinely is. This is the phrase that Aristotle turned over with care, what each genuinely is, not the pleasure they occasion, not even the image they project, but the actual character of the person, the stable pattern of disposition and choice and response that makes them who they are across all circumstances, in difficulty as in ease, in failure as in success. And the love in this friendship is directed at exactly that, at the person themselves, in their full and tested particularity. He called the quality that grounds this kind of love goodwill, eunoia, but he was careful about what he meant. Goodwill is not yet friendship. A person can feel goodwill toward a stranger they have heard good things about, wishing them well in a vague and general way, without ever having spoken to them or shared any time with them. This is a real and valuable disposition, but it is too thin, too unreciprocated, too uninformed by actual knowledge of the other person's character to constitute even the beginning of what Aristotle meant by friendship. For goodwill to become friendship, it must be mutual. Both people must know the goodwill exists, and it must be directed not at an abstraction, the idea of a virtuous person, but at a particular person known through actual experience, recognized in their actual particularity. The precision here matters. Aristotle was not describing an ideal that no one achieves. He was describing a structure and paying close attention to what elements the structure requires before it can bear weight. Goodwill matters, mutuality matters, recognition matters, time matters, and this last point he returned to often, because he knew that what passes for genuine knowledge of another person's character in the early stages of a relationship is almost always something more like a hopeful impression. The full knowledge that grounds complete friendship cannot be hastened. It accumulates the way all things of substance accumulate, slowly, through repeated contact with the actual rather than the hoped for. The friendship he was describing required that both people have the kind of character that makes their goodwill stable, not mood dependent, not interest dependent, not held together by the pleasant accident of shared taste. Virtue, in Aristotle's sense, is a set of stable dispositions, a durable pattern of feeling and choosing and responding that holds across circumstances. Two people of this kind, meeting and coming to know each other fully, would find their goodwill grounded in something that does not move when conditions change, because what they love in each other is not a condition, but a character, and character, properly formed, endures. The students had mostly gone by the time the day's warmth began to leave the stones of the walkway. One or two remained, reading by the last of the light, but the Lyceum had taken on the particular quiet of a working day, concluding, tools set down, thinking still continuing in the body's half-awareness, even as the formal session ended. Aristotle set down his stylus. The lamp would need to be lit soon if he intended to continue. There is something worth staying with in the way he held all three of these friendships at once, without collapsing them into each other and without dismissing any of them as unreal. The merchant and his trading partner share something genuine. The young people gathered around a vitally present friend share something genuine, and what they share resembles, from a certain distance, the complete friendship. It has the same surface features, the same social visibility, the same warmth, but the resemblance is, Aristotle thought, the kind of resemblance a sketch bears to a finished painting, not false, but incomplete, lacking the depth that comes from having been worked through fully. He did not say this to diminish what the merchants and the young people have. He said it because he thought that knowing the difference, knowing what kind of friendship one is in, and what conditions hold it together, is itself a form of practical wisdom. A person who mistakes a friendship of utility for a friendship of virtue has not simply made a sentimental error. They have misread the structure of something they are depending on, and when it shifts, as it will, they will not understand why, and the incomprehension will hurt more than the loss. Understanding the structure of a bond is not the same as devaluing it. A merchant who knows that his warm dealings with a partner are held together by mutual advantage can value that warmth genuinely, can depend on it appropriately, can let it be exactly what it is without asking it to be something more permanent than it is capable of being. There is a kind of respect in this, the respect of accurate attention, which is different from, and in some ways more honest, than the respect of wishful description. The same is true for friendships of pleasure. The young people in the room where the wit's laughter fills the evening are not in a lesser condition than they would be if they understood more clearly that their warmth for one another is organized around a particular quality of shared enjoyment rather than a deep mutual knowledge of character. They are simply in the condition they are in. Aristotle's taxonomy does not reach into that room and dampen the evening. It only offers, to anyone interested in understanding what they are experiencing, a precise way to name it. And precision, in Aristotle's account, is never hostile to the thing it names. It is the condition of knowing it truly. The evening light at the Lyceum, when the lamp is finally lit and the flame catches and settles into stillness, has a quality that Athens in the 4th century BCE must have shared with every other city where people have gathered to think together at the end of a day. The particular warmth of a closed space holding the warmth of the people inside it. Aristotle, in that light, having written what he had written and set the stylus down, was not dismissing the lesser friendships. He was locating them within a larger account of what friendship, at its fullest, can become. The lower friendships contain something real, and they contain it because they contain a genuine element of goodwill, however partial, however organized around something other than the person themselves. In this sense, Aristotle thought they do not merely resemble complete friendship, they participate in it in the way that a sketch participates in what the finished painting will be, carrying within its tentative lines the shape of something not yet fully achieved. The goodwill in a friendship of utility is real goodwill. The pleasure in a friendship of pleasure is genuine enjoyment of another person's presence. Neither of these is nothing. Neither of these is an imposture. They are, as Aristotle said, genuine instances of friendship, true, if partial, realizations of something whose complete form requires more time, more testing, more stability of character, more depth of mutual knowledge. What they lack, in his account, is the thing that makes complete friendship unconditional. In a friendship of utility, the goodwill is conditional on the continuation of the advantage. In a friendship of pleasure, The affection is conditional on the continuation of the enjoyment. Both conditions can be real and valuable and can sustain genuine warmth over long stretches of time. But both can also change, and when they change, the bond that rested on them has nothing else to hold it. Complete friendship, by contrast, rests on the character of the persons themselves, which is in Aristotle's account of what character is, precisely the thing in a person that does not simply change when circumstances change. It can grow, it can deepen, it can be tested and confirmed. But the stable person, whose virtues are genuinely formed, is not a different person tomorrow because today brought a different advantage or a different pleasure. This is why the complete friendship is rare. Not because virtue is rare in the sense of being exotic or exceptional, but because two people of stable and matching character, coming to know each other deeply through the accumulated weight of time and shared experience, is something that cannot be arranged or hastened. It requires that both people have already done the long and unseen work of character formation, the habituation through which dispositions become stable, through which the person who chooses well in the morning also chooses well in the afternoon, without needing to deliberate it each time. And it requires that they have spent enough time together in enough varied circumstances that each has come to know the other not as they appear on a good day, but as they actually are across the whole range of what a life contains. Aristotle noted, with characteristic directness, that complete friendships are therefore not numerous. The deep mutual knowledge they require is time-consuming, and time is finite. A person can maintain a very large number of friendships of utility and a reasonable number of friendships of pleasure. But the friends one knows truly, in the full sense that virtue friendship requires, the people who know one's character as it actually is, who have seen one fail and return, who wish one well, not for any advantage they derive from the wishing, but simply because they love the person, these friends are few. This is not a sad observation in Aristotle's account. It is simply the observation that some things require a great deal to be what they are, and that what they require explains why they are not common. Two people of this kind sit together somewhere in the evening. The description is plain and carries its own weight. They have known each other long enough that the things which usually require performance, the demonstration of goodwill, the signaling of trustworthiness, the managing of impression, have all become unnecessary. Neither person needs to perform themselves for the other, because the other already knows who they are, has known for years, and has not looked away. What passes between them in a given hour may be very ordinary, a shared meal, a walk, a conversation that covers nothing remarkable, but it carries the weight of everything that has preceded it, the accumulated history of mutual knowledge that makes even the most ordinary exchange feel to both of them like being recognized. This is the friendship Aristotle was working toward when he set his stylus down in the failing light of the Lyceum, not the warmth of transaction, though that warmth is real, not the brightness of shared pleasure, though that brightness is genuine. The third thing, the thing that contains in itself something of both the others, the practical care of people who genuinely wish each other well and act accordingly, and the pleasure of being in the company of someone whose presence makes the hours feel worth living, but that grounds both of these in something deeper than advantage and more durable than enjoyment. He was precise about the way it contains the lower forms rather than simply replacing them. A person of complete virtue friendship does not cease to derive practical benefit from a friend's company. The counsel of a genuinely wise and caring friend is among the most useful things a person can have access to, and Aristotle would not have denied this. And the pleasure of spending time with someone one genuinely loves and admires is not absent from complete friendship. On the contrary, It is present in it more fully than in any other form, because it is the pleasure of being with the person themselves rather than with their usefulness or their entertainment value. The complete friendship absorbs the lower forms and gives them a firmer ground. A friendship that began between two young Athenians as a pleasure friendship, drawn together by the vitality and wit of each other's company, does not cease to be such a friendship when it deepens. It becomes more than it was. There is a moment, which Aristotle describes with care, when two people who have been enjoying each other's company begin to discover that they are also, without quite having decided to be, witnesses to each other's character. The pleasure is still there, but something else has arrived alongside it, a quality of mutual attention that is no longer organized only around enjoyment, because each person has begun to see in the other not only what is pleasant, but what is real. This is the threshold at which a friendship of pleasure begins, if the characters of both people are suited to it, and the time and attention are given freely to move towards something more complete. Aristotle did not describe this movement as an achievement or a goal to be worked toward. He described it as something that happens naturally and without ceremony, when the conditions are right, when the characters of both people are stable enough to be known truly, and when the time given to the friendship has been long enough and varied enough for the knowledge to accumulate into something dependable. The movement from partial to complete friendship is not a transition one can engineer. It is a consequence of being the right kind of person in the right kind of relationship for long enough. The lamp in the Lyceum burned with that steady, small, unconditional light that oil lamps produce, not bright enough to read by easily, but sufficient to hold the darkness back and to make visible the faces of the people in the room. Aristotle had written what he needed to write for the day. The students who remained had gathered closer to the lamp, their tablets on their knees, speaking quietly to each other in the way that people speak at the end of a day, when the formal thinking has concluded and the informal, half-conscious continuation of it has begun. They were doing, without quite knowing they were doing it, what he had been writing about, being together in the particular ease of people who know each other well enough to think alongside each other, rather than performing thought for each other. The taxonomy he had laid out, utility, pleasure, complete friendship, was not a ladder to be climbed. It was not a ranking of people by their moral achievement, with the virtuous at the top and the commercial at the bottom. It was, more precisely, a map, and what the map was mapping was not the worth of persons, but the conditions under which love can deepen, or the conditions under which it will remain exactly where it is. A friendship held together by mutual advantage is held where it is by the nature of what holds it. A friendship held together by shared pleasure is held where it is by the nature of what holds it. And a friendship held together by the mutual recognition of genuine character is held by something that, unlike advantage and unlike pleasure, does not shift when the world shifts around it. The distinction between partial and complete is not, in Aristotle's account, a moral reproach. It is an observation about structure. Most of the friendships in any life will be friendships of utility or pleasure, and they will be real, and they will matter, and they will be, in their particular domains, as good as any bond can be that is organized around the things that organize them. The warmth between two merchants who have dealt honestly with each other for years is not a small thing. The pleasure of an evening spent with people whose company makes the hours feel brighter is not a lesser kind of happiness. These are genuine goods, genuinely shared, genuinely worth having. What Aristotle was pointing at was only this, that there is something beyond them, something that contains them and completes them, something that requires more of both people and gives more in return. And the complete friendship, the friendship of matched virtue, of deep mutual knowledge, of love directed at the person themselves, rather than at anything they provide, does not dismiss the lower forms as unworthy. It includes them. The pleasure of being with a genuinely good friend is real. The practical benefit of having someone who truly wishes you well and will tell you the truth is real. These are present in the complete friendship, more fully than anywhere else, because they are no longer conditional on anything other than the continued existence of the persons themselves. The lamp burned on in the Lyceum. The city outside had grown quiet in the way that cities grow quiet when the day's commerce is done and the evening's domesticity has not yet begun. That particular interval of stillness that belongs to no activity, when the quality of silence feels less like absence than like rest. The students nearby had settled into their own shared quiet, the tablets forgotten, the thinking continuing in the way that thinking continues when it no longer requires effort, not stopped but released, moving on its own without supervision. What Aristotle had been doing in the careful attention he brought to all three kinds of friendship was not ranking, but seeing. The physician's habit his father had given him to look at what is actually there before reaching for what ought to be there, to describe accurately before prescribing ambitiously, to know the partial thing truly before naming it incomplete. The friendship of utility is true. The friendship of pleasure is true. And the complete friendship is the truth that contains both of them, not their replacement, but their fulfillment, the form toward which, given the right persons and the right time and the right quality of sustained attention, a bond can slowly, without urgency, arrive. The lamp held its small, steady light. The night gathered around the Lyceum with the patience that nights have always had, asking nothing, offering only the particular darkness that makes a lit room feel like what it is, a place where people are together in the warmth of what they share. At the Lyceum, in the middle of one of those mornings that have not yet decided whether they will be warm, Aristotle paused in a conversation with his students and posed a question that was not rhetorical, not a trap, not a way of leading somewhere he had already decided to go. He asked whether a person who had everything, sufficient food, shelter from the weather, no illness worth naming, no debt, no enemy, every material condition of a life arranged in good order, whether such a person, living entirely alone, could be said to be happy. He let the question sit. The students who had gathered near him on the shaded paths of the gymnasium did not answer immediately, and the pause before anyone spoke was the kind of pause in which the honest difficulty of a question makes itself felt, where the first tentative answers form and then dissolve before they can be offered, where the person being asked begins to realize that what they took to be an obvious answer is not obvious at all. Someone may have said yes. The material conditions seem complete. Someone else may have hesitated. Aristotle, by all accounts, was patient with hesitation. He considered it the appropriate response to a genuine question. And then, in whatever form the answer eventually came, the students found themselves confronted with a counterpoint that had been waiting underneath the question from the beginning. What would such a person do with their courage, living alone? To whom would they be just? What would their generosity have to work on, and their honesty, and their care for another's welfare, if there were no other person toward whom any of these could be directed? The virtues, Aristotle suggested, are not ornaments one can wear in private. They are capacities that only become fully real in relation to others. A courage that has never been exercised in the presence of fear is potential, not actual. A generosity that has never given anything to anyone is still only a disposition, waiting for the world to call it into action. Without others, the best parts of a person remain folded inward, possible but not present. The way a word one has never spoken is still somehow less real than a word one has said aloud. This was not a rhetorical flourish or a clever academic puzzle. Aristotle had come to it through careful observation of how people actually live and of what the human form of life, at its fullest, actually requires. In the Nicomachean Ethics, where he sets out the argument with care, he arrives at it from the direction of eudaimonia, the word Greek gives to the state of living and faring well, that we sometimes translate as happiness, though happiness is too narrow and too passive a word for what he means. Eudaimonia is closer to flourishing. It is the full actualization of what a human being most essentially is, a creature capable of reason, of virtuous action, of sustained and thoughtful engagement with the world and the people in it. And this kind of flourishing, Aristotle held, is not available in isolation, because what a human being most essentially is not a self-sufficient atom, but a political animal, a being whose nature is completed only in community with others. The question he posed to his students was, in the end, this: can a tree flourish without soil? The answer, when it arrives in his written work, is patient and particular. It does not simply say that humans need each other in the way they need food or warmth. It traces the specific shape of the need. Among all the things that contribute to eudaimonia, Aristotle identifies friendship as one of the most necessary, not as an aid to it, not as a pleasant supplement to it, but as one of the forms it takes. A person living in the fullest expression of their own nature will not be alone, not because loneliness is painful, though it may be, but because the fullest exercise of human virtue reaches outward, and what it reaches toward, in its completest form, is a particular other person whose character is known and whose good is genuinely wished. To understand what Aristotle means by character, by the Greek word ethos, it is necessary to set aside the modern tendency to treat character as something either fixed from birth or chosen in a moment of decision. Character for Aristotle is neither given nor chosen all at once. It is built. It is the accumulation of habits, of ways of feeling, of perceiving, of responding, that are repeated until they become stable, until they become, as he puts it, second nature. A person becomes courageous by acting courageously, even before they feel courageous, until the action and the feeling align and the disposition holds. A person becomes honest by choosing honesty in circumstances where dishonesty would be easier, again and again, until the choice is no longer effortful, but simply the shape of who they are. Character is not a snapshot. It is a long history of small decisions, and each decision leaves a trace, and the accumulation of traces is what a person, finally, is. This matters for friendship, because genuine friendship, in Aristotle's account, is friendship of character. It is not friendship of circumstance, though circumstance can bring people together. It is not friendship of mood, though mood can make the hours spent with another person more or less warm. It is a bond that rests on something more stable and more demanding than either, on the actual qualities of the other person, known over time, found to be real, and loved for what they are rather than for what they provide. And because character is something built slowly, known slowly, the kind of friendship that is grounded in character is also something built slowly. It cannot be hastened. There is a quality in Aristotle's writing here that is almost like insistence, not urgency, but the calm insistence of someone who has understood that certain things cannot be shortcut without being changed into something else, the way bread cannot be baked faster than it bakes without becoming something that is not quite bread. He reaches for an image that has a quality of domestic ordinariness that makes it oddly vivid. To know another person's character, he suggests, requires the proverbial sharing of a bushel of salt. The Greek word he uses for this kind of intimacy is sonetheia, habitual closeness, the closeness that comes from habitation together, from time shared not only in the exceptional moments when character is tested severely, but in the ordinary ones. The hundreds of ordinary meals and conversations and disagreements and silences out of which real knowledge of a person is slowly assembled. A bushel of salt is a considerable quantity. Consumed at a table, with bread and ordinary food, a few grains at a time, it represents years of proximity. The image asks for patience. It asks for the willingness to let understanding develop at the speed understanding actually develops, which is much slower than the speed at which impressions form, and much slower than the speed at which, in certain conditions, warmth and feeling arise. Feeling can arrive quickly. Knowledge of another person cannot, and what Aristotle is pointing at, in his careful and unhurried way, is the difference between a hopeful impression of someone, what they seem to be, in the early and relatively undemanding hours of a new acquaintance, and a genuine understanding of who they are, earned through extended and varied experience that has included difficulty, disagreement, and the ordinary daily texture of a life shared over a long stretch of time. Sonetheia, then, is not simply time accumulated, it is time filled with the kind of experience that generates real knowledge. Two people who have spent years in each other's company without ever finding themselves in circumstances that required much of either of them have spent time together, but not necessarily the kind of time that produces the knowledge of character. Aristotle is describing what is required is variety, the range of experience that allows a person's way of being to become visible across many different conditions. Generosity is visible when something must actually be given. Patience is visible when there is genuinely something to be patient about. Honesty is visible when the truth is inconvenient. None of these can be assessed from pleasant shared afternoons alone, though the pleasant afternoons are part of what is accumulated, and they are not nothing, they are part of the salt, but they are not all of it. There is something in this account that has a quality of protection in it. Aristotle is not being cold or suspicious when he insists on time and varied experience as the necessary conditions for genuine knowledge of another person's character. He is being careful in the way a physician is careful when they insist on proper diagnosis before prescribing treatment. The rush to know, the desire to claim intimacy before it has actually been established, the wish to have already arrived at the depth that only extended time can produce, is in its way a kind of impatience that often ends in disillusionment. The person who seemed, in the warmth of an early friendship, to be generous and patient and honest may turn out over time and difficulty to be less reliably any of these things than they appeared. The disappointment is real, but in Aristotle's account it is also partly a consequence of having claimed to know more than the time available could actually have shown. The bushel of salt is not a discouragement. It is a description of how knowledge of character actually accumulates, and once understood, it has the quality of relief. The deep friendship is not unavailable. It simply requires what it requires, and what it requires is time. Among the students who walked the paths of the Lyceum, these questions were not merely theoretical. Aristotle had chosen to situate his philosophical community in a place where the act of thinking together was itself a kind of practice, where the shared intellectual life of the gymnasium enacted in a smaller key the claims about human nature that the ethics was simultaneously developing. People who gather regularly to think together, to disagree, and to continue, to hold their own positions with conviction, while remaining genuinely open to what others bring, are practicing something that has a structural resemblance to what Aristotle describes as sonatheia. They are accumulating the shared experience out of which real knowledge of one another develops. Not all of them would have been friends in Aristotle's fullest sense. The community was too large, and virtue friendship of the kind he describes requires a particular matched quality between two people that cannot be manufactured or organized at scale. But the conditions in which it might form were present, and the activity of shared inquiry had the quality of the kind of shared life that Aristotle thought of as both a preparation for and an expression of the good that human beings, living together, are capable of reaching. The question Aristotle is circling in these passages, the question of what it means to wish another person well for their own sake, is one that his answer approaches slowly and from several angles before it arrives at something that can rest. He distinguishes with care between wishing someone well because their welfare serves one's own interest, wishing someone well because their company is pleasant and one's own experience of them is enjoyable, and wishing someone well in a way that is genuinely independent of either of these. The first two forms of goodwill are real. He does not dismiss them or treat them as impostures, but they have a conditional structure. The goodwill in them is organized around something other than the other person, around the benefit that flows from the relationship, or around the enjoyment that the relationship produces. When the benefit ceases, or when the enjoyment fades, the goodwill organized around them tends to dissolve with them. This is not a moral failure, it is simply what those forms of goodwill are made of. Goodwill of the third kind. The goodwill that is directed at the other person as such, at who they are, rather than at what they provide or how they feel to be around, has a different structure. It is directed not at the accidental features of the relationship, but at something more stable, at the character of the other person, at the particular form of excellence they have developed and express in the conduct of their life. And because character is more stable than circumstance, and more durable than mood, the goodwill that is grounded in it has a corresponding durability. This is the goodwill Aristotle calls unconditional, not because it is immune to change or loss. Friendships can end, people can change, the world can intervene, but because its ground is not contingent on any particular external arrangement continuing. The Greek phrase Aristotle uses to name this orientation is ekenon, heneka. It means roughly for the other's own sake. It is a phrase of direction. It indicates the object of the caring, and the object is not oneself, not one's own pleasure or benefit, but the person one cares for. The phrase is small. It carries a great deal. What it points at is the quality of attention that makes a friendship genuine in Aristotle's sense, an attention that is genuinely other-directed, that wills good things for the other because the other's good matters as such, not as an instrument to anything else. This is not altruism in a self-sacrificial sense. Aristotle is not asking anyone to diminish themselves for the sake of another. He is describing something more like a natural expansion of the field of what one cares about, an expansion in which another person's flourishing becomes part of what one is oriented toward, not as an obligation, but as a genuine feature of one's own good. A person of settled character, going about their ordinary day, choosing how to spend time, deciding what to say and what to leave unsaid, noticing the people they encounter and responding to them with more or less care, is enacting in that ordinary activity the habits that make them who they are. Nothing dramatic is required. The virtues that Aristotle cares about are not primarily displayed in exceptional circumstances, though exceptional circumstances can reveal them clearly. They are present or absent in the texture of an ordinary day. The person who is genuinely honest is not only honest when the stakes are high, they are honest in the small and unmemorable moments when a partial truth would have been easier and no one would have noticed. The person who is genuinely generous does not only give when giving is visible, they give in the unseen and ordinary moments that leave no record. Character is what holds constant across all of it, the visible and the invisible, the tested and the untested, the exceptional and the utterly ordinary. This has implications for friendship that Aristotle draws out with particular care. If character is stable, and if genuine friendship is grounded in character, then genuine friendship has a quality of stability that friendships grounded in utility or pleasure cannot fully match. A friendship of utility lasts as long as the arrangement is mutually beneficial. A friendship of pleasure lasts as long as the enjoyment continues. But a friendship of character, a friendship grounded in the actual qualities of the people involved, has no expiration date attached to any external condition. The arrangement might change. The pleasure of each other's company might become more muted with time, or more textured, or simply more comfortable in a way that looks less like pleasure and more like ease. But the ground of the friendship, which is who each person is, does not dissolve when circumstances shift. It is still there, patient and actual, available to the relationship whenever the relationship needs to draw on it. There is an image for this that Aristotle does not explicitly use, but that his account quietly generates. Two people who have shared years of difficulty and celebration and disagreement and return are sitting together in a way that requires no performance. Neither of them needs to demonstrate anything. The period of demonstration is long past, passed through, traversed, left behind somewhere in the accumulated ordinary time of the relationship. What remains is not the excitement of not yet knowing, but the ease of having already known, tested, and returned to. This ease is not the absence of engagement. It is a particular quality of presence that belongs only to people who have long since stopped having to wonder whether they are genuinely known. Being genuinely known is not the reward the friendship eventually produces. It is one of the forms the friendship itself takes. Aristotle reaches for this idea from an angle that might seem unexpected. He suggests that the virtuous friend functions as a kind of mirror, not a flattering mirror, not a surface that reflects back what one wishes to see, but something more honest and more useful than that. The honest and caring attention of a person who genuinely knows one's character, and who is genuinely oriented toward one's good, rather than toward maintaining a comfortable version of the relationship, has a particular perceptual quality. It shows things that are difficult to see about oneself. Self-examination, conducted alone, is valuable, and Aristotle does not dismiss it. But it has a structural limitation. The person examining themselves brings to the examination all the same habits of perception, all the same tendencies towards self-justification and self-flattery that are part of the very character they are trying to assess. A person who tends towards self-deception will tend to deceive themselves in the act of self-examination as surely as in any other act. A person who has developed a habit of interpreting their own actions charitably will interpret their own character charitably when they look at it. The virtuous friend, looking from outside, is not subject to these particular limitations. Their attachment to who one actually is, not to who one wishes to be, or who one presents oneself as being, but to who one demonstrably and actually is, gives their perception a reliability that purely internal self-examination cannot match. This is not because the friend is cold, or critical, or looking for failures. The mirror Aristotle describes is held by someone who cares, and it is precisely the caring that makes the honesty bearable, and bearable in a particular way, not as a wound or a reproach, but as the kind of truth that feels, when it arrives in the right hands, like something one needed and can use. The gratitude that follows honest, caring reflection from a genuine friend is quieter than the gratitude one feels for praise, but it is more durable and it changes more. What the mirror shows in Aristotle's account is not only specific actions or failures, but something more general, the shape of one's character as it actually presents itself in the world. A person can believe themselves to be patient and find in the mirror of a genuine friendship that what they have been practicing is not patience but avoidance, that they have been tolerating rather than enduring, accommodating rather than choosing. A person can believe themselves to be generous and find that the generosity they have been practicing comes with conditions they had not acknowledged, that it flows more easily towards certain people than others, and that the pattern reveals something about the self-interest underneath. These are not comfortable revelations, but they are the kind of revelations that make growth possible, not the growth that is performed for others, not the self-improvement that is essentially a project of self-presentation, but the quieter and more difficult growth that begins with honestly seeing what is actually there. Aristotle is careful not to frame this as a burden. The mirror is not a judgment seat. The virtuous friend who holds it is not positioned above the person being seen. They are beside them in the relationship, also subject to being seen, also capable of being known more clearly through the attention of someone who cares for them for their own sake. The mutual quality of genuine friendship is essential here. It is not one person illuminating another from a position of greater wisdom. It is two people, over time, becoming more legible to each other, and through that mutual legibility, becoming more legible to themselves, finding in the other's honest and caring attention something they could not have found through solitary reflection alone. The philosophical argument underlying this image is one of the quietest and most precise things in Aristotle's Ethics. He holds that the capacity to know oneself clearly, to see one's own character with anything approaching accuracy, is not straightforwardly available through introspection alone, not because introspection is worthless, but because the self-examining self is not a neutral instrument. It is already shaped by the habits, tendencies, and characteristic interpretive moves that constitute its character, and those habits will be active in the act of examining themselves. To get around them, even partially, requires a perspective that does not share them in the same way. And the only source of such a perspective that is also genuinely oriented toward one's good, rather than merely detached from one's self-interest, which is a different and less useful thing, is a person who knows one well, cares for one's genuine flourishing, and has enough of their own settled character to be honest without cruelty. None of this is available in the early days of an acquaintance. It develops across the accumulated ordinary time of a friendship that has been tested and has held, and the testing, Aristotle suggests, is not something to be feared or avoided. It is part of what converts the early goodwill of a new friendship, genuine, warm, but as yet largely uninformed, into the settled and durable knowledge of character that genuine friendship requires. The difficulty is not the sign that something has gone wrong. The difficulty is the salt being consumed, a few grains at a time, at the table of an ordinary shared life. There is a kind of friendship that begins in pleasure and finds as it continues that something else has quietly settled in underneath the pleasure, something with more gravity and more permanence. Two people who began by enjoying each other's company discover at some point that is usually impossible to locate precisely, that they have become witnesses to each other's lives in a way that has its own weight. They have been present for the ordinary days. They have seen each other tired and uncertain and less than their best, and have not looked away. They have disagreed and returned. They have eaten the salt, though they did not call it that, and the accumulation of it has produced something that cannot be reduced to enjoyment, though the enjoyment has not disappeared. It has simply become one thread in something larger and more textured. Aristotle would say that this is the threshold being crossed, the threshold from a friendship that is real and warm but partial into something closer to the complete form, something grounded in who each person is, rather than in what each person in this moment provides. The word Aristotle uses for the fullest form of friendship, teleophilia, contains the Greek root for completion or wholeness. It is not that the lower forms of friendship are deficient or defective. It is that they are, in his account, partial expressions of something whose full form includes their best qualities, while also grounding them in something more stable. The complete friendship is not cold. It is not without pleasure. It is not a philosophical exercise masquerading as a human relationship. It is a relationship that contains warmth and enjoyment and practical mutual support, but that does not depend on any of these for its continued existence, because its ground is something that does not dissolve when the warmth fades, or the arrangement shifts, or the years accumulate, and the early brightness of the friendship matures into something quieter and more settled. What that ground is, stated simply, is virtue, the matched and mutual recognition of genuine excellence in each other, and the genuine wish, organized not around one's own benefit or pleasure, but around the other's actual flourishing, that the other person should live and be well, lakainon henika, for their own sake. The orientation is not demanding, it is not effortful in a mature friendship of this kind, in the way that effort is usually felt. It has become, through long habit, simply the way one is toward this person, the natural direction of one's caring, as natural as the direction of one's attention when one hears a familiar voice in a room one had not expected them to enter. The image of the virtuous friend as mirror, not a polished surface reflecting a comfortable likeness, but a person whose honest and caring attention shows one something that could not have been seen alone, does not lose its gentleness in being an image of honesty. The mirror held by someone who genuinely cares for one's flourishing is not a mirror of judgment. It is a mirror of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that can only be built through the patient accumulation of shared ordinary time, through the tested and returned to quality of a friendship that has lasted long enough to see the person through several versions of themselves. What is reflected in such a mirror is not a verdict. It is a form of recognition, the recognition that being truly seen by someone who cares for one's actual good is not a threat to the self. It is, in Aristotle's quiet and considered view, one of the ways the self becomes most fully and most stably what it is, and that what is found in genuine friendship is not the loss of the solitude in which one knows oneself, but the discovery that the self is most present to itself in the company of another person who is genuinely and without remainder oriented toward its good. The afternoon light at the Lyceum had begun to flatten, the way it does in Athens in the weeks before the rains come, pressing itself low and golden across the gymnasium's open ground. The shaded walkways that Aristotle preferred for teaching had grown quieter in that hour. Most of the students had moved indoors. Aristotle himself sat near the eastern colonnade, a wax tablet resting across his knees, a stylus held loosely in his right hand, not quite writing, not quite resting, the posture of a person in whom thought and composition had grown so habituated to each other that neither could fully begin without the other's presence. He had been working through a passage about the nature of the self, not the dramatic, elevated self of the Platonic dialogues, the soul ascending toward the form of the good, but the ordinary, situated, embodied self that wakes in the morning with its habits already in place, moves through the day according to its character, and ends the afternoon not necessarily wiser, but perhaps a little more honestly observed. It was in this passage, by all accounts, that the phrase arrived, not announced, not introduced as a technical term, set down in the middle of a sentence as though it had always been there waiting, allos autos. Another self. The phrase does something unusual when it first comes into contact with a reader. It does not feel like a discovery. It feels like a recognition, the naming of something already present that had not, until that moment, been named. And in that quality of recognition, the phrase itself becomes an example of what it is describing, the experience of finding, in something outside yourself, an exact fit with something you had only half known was inside you. What Aristotle was claiming was precise. He was not offering a metaphor about closeness or warmth. He was not saying that a true friend feels like family, or that a true friend knows your mind. He was making a structural claim about what the self is and what happens to it in genuine friendship, that the boundaries of the self, carefully examined, are not where common assumption places them, and that in the kind of friendship, grounded in virtue and character, another person's existence can become genuinely constitutive of one's own good, not supplementary, not comforting, constitutive, the way a roof beam is not an addition to a house, but part of what makes the house itself possible. To understand why he said this, it helps to follow the argument back to where it begins, which is not with friendship at all, but with the self. There is a kind of love a person has for themselves that Aristotle considers entirely proper, not vanity, not the reflexive self-protection of someone threatened. Something quieter and more fundamental, a person who is well ordered within themselves, whose reasoning and feeling and choosing have been trained over time into something coherent. That person has, in Aristotle's view, a settled relationship with who they are. They take genuine pleasure in their own company. They are not fleeing themselves. They can reflect honestly on their own actions, without the reflection curdling into either self-congratulation or despair, and from this settled inner life, something can flow outward: care, counsel, constancy, the qualities we most associate with deep friendship. Aristotle held that these qualities, all of them without exception, have their structural origin in this well-ordered relationship a good person has with themselves. Constancy in friendship mirrors the constancy one has to one's own values. Honest counsel mirrors the honest self-assessment one performs in private. Goodwill toward another mirrors the genuine investment one has in one's own rational flourishing. None of these can be extended in any durable form from a self that is chaotic, fragmented, or fundamentally at war with its own nature. A person who has not managed a working relationship with their own inner life cannot offer another person the things that constitute genuine friendship. The outward gestures may be there. The warmth may even be real, but something below the warmth will be missing, a ground on which the warmth can stand and not shift. This is a demanding claim. It is not, however, a harsh one. Aristotle does not say this in the spirit of judgment. He says it in the spirit of a physician who has looked carefully at how things actually work and is reporting what he has found. A person without an integrated inner life can still be a friend and a real one in the lower forms of friendship, where the bond is lighter and the demands less exacting. What they cannot be is what Aristotle calls a complete friend, a second self, because that relationship requires two selves stable enough to be genuinely present to each other. Now consider the other form of self-love, the one Aristotle distinguishes from the proper kind with considerable care. This is the self-love of the person who assigns to themselves the greatest share, not of what is noble and rational and genuinely good, but of money, honor, and the satisfaction of appetite. The person who takes and takes, who positions themselves at the center of every exchange, who cultivates in others whatever will be most useful and discards whatever is not. This person is, in the common language, selfish. And Aristotle's response to selfishness is not quite what one might expect. He does not say this person loves themselves too much. He says they love themselves incorrectly, that they have mistaken which part of themselves to cultivate and which to restrain. By feeding the appetitive part and starving the rational and moral part, the selfish person paradoxically fails to love himself as a self at all. He loves what he happens to want. He loves his pleasure, his accumulation, his image. These are real enough as objects of attachment, but they are not a self. They are a collection of passing states dressed up as one. The visible difference between these two kinds of people, when encountered in friendship, is something almost physical. The well-ordered person brings a quality of presence to their friendships, an actual attention to the other person, an interest that is genuinely in the other, rather than in what the other can provide. The person who loves themselves in the corrupted way brings something else, a kind of orientation that is always, even in its warmest moments, subtly pointing back toward itself. The other person is in view, but they are never quite the view. They are always slightly in service of something else, of comfort or of image, or of the simple relief of not being alone. The difference is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is barely visible at all. But over time, in the texture of years, the difference becomes the thing that determines what a relationship actually is. Return now to the phrase itself, allos otos, another self. What does it mean for another person to be a second self? It does not mean that the boundary between two people disappears. Two people in genuine friendship do not become a single entity, and Aristotle is not suggesting anything so obscure. What he is suggesting is that in the friendship between people of genuinely matched character, the friend's good becomes part of what one actually cares about, not as an obligation, not as a strategic investment in goodwill, not even as the natural warmth of affection, but as something closer to how one cares about one's own good. The friend's flourishing is not located in some separate moral ledger under the heading of altruism. It is located in the same place one's own flourishing is located. The friend has been incorporated, not absorbed. They remain themselves entirely. And yet their existence has become, in some sense, that requires careful examination, part of the structure of one's own good life. Aristotle noticed something about this that is easy to miss. When a good person reviews their own actions, not with anxiety, but with the patient, honest attention he recommends, they find they cannot do this cleanly alone. The friend's perspective has become, over years, part of the apparatus of self-examination. To ask whether one acted rightly is partly to ask how a particular person would see it, not because one fears judgment, but because that person's sight has been incorporated into one's own. They have become, in this specific sense, a part of how one sees what the friend would see. One now sees as well, and in seeing it, one is both more honest and more whole than solitary examination alone would make possible. This is why Aristotle described the virtuous friend as a kind of mirror, though not the polished, flattering kind. A mirror that shows only the best version of a face is not a useful mirror. The mirror a good friend provides shows something more accurate and therefore more valuable, the face as it actually is, held in an attention that is both honest and caring, neither cruel nor comforting in the way that reassurance is comforting. The honesty has warmth in it. The warmth has honesty in it. Neither is sacrificed for the other. And what one sees in that reflection is oneself more clearly than one can manage alone, precisely because the friend's attachment is to who one actually is, not to who one would like to be thought of as. Think of what it means to have been seen in this way over a long period of time, to have been known not at one's best moment or in one's most careful self-presentation, but across the full range of the ordinary, including the less careful days, the moments of smallness, the reflexes one would prefer not to have. And then consider that the friendship has continued through all of that, not despite what was seen, but with full knowledge of it. There is a particular quality that a relationship acquires after this kind of sustained mutual witness. It is different from intimacy grounded in novelty, or in shared enthusiasm, or in the pleasure of being well understood at a superficial level. It is quieter and more structural than any of those things. It becomes part of the landscape of the self, something one would not know how to subtract from the picture of who one is. Aristotle was aware that this kind of relationship is rare. He said so plainly, not as a lament, more as an observation, the way one might note that old trees are rarer than young ones, which is simply what it means for something to require a long time to grow. The rarity does not diminish the possibility. It explains why the possibility is worth understanding with precision, why it is worth distinguishing from the friendships of utility and pleasure that occupy so much more of ordinary life, and that are real and valuable and not to be dismissed, but that are not quite this. There is a further dimension of this idea that Aristotle attends to with care: reciprocity. Genuine friendship, in his account, is not one-sided admiration, however sincere. It is not the intense attachment of a person who loves another without the other's full and equal participation. These forms of one-sided connection are real. Aristotle acknowledges their reality, but they lack something that is structural to the complete form. They lack mutual recognition. Both parties must know the bond exists, must actively affirm it, and must be genuinely oriented toward each other's good, rather than toward an idealized version of the other, or toward the feeling the other produces. This is not a demand for perfect symmetry at every moment. Over the course of a long friendship, there will be seasons of asymmetry, one person leaning heavily, the other bearing more of the weight, and then the balance shifting in the other direction as circumstances change. What matters is not equilibrium in any given moment, but something more durable, that each person in a settled and conscious way is pointed toward the other, not performing care, not maintaining a social arrangement, actually pointed. The distinction between genuine reciprocity and its imitations is not always easy to see from the outside, and Aristotle does not pretend otherwise. It takes time to become visible. It emerges in the choices people make when the cost of caring is high, when honesty is uncomfortable, when presence is inconvenient, when the friend's need conflicts with one's own preference. In those moments, the structure of the relationship becomes legible in a way it is not when everything is easy. The question of whether a friend is oriented toward the other for the other's own sake. The Greek phrase is eke non heneka, for the sake of that person, is answered slowly across precisely those moments. This phrase, eke non heneca, is one of the most important things Aristotle says about complete friendship, and it is easy to pass it too quickly. To wish good things for another person for that person's own sake is to wish them well, regardless of what their well being produces for oneself, not regardless of one's feelings for them. The feelings are real and significant and part of the bond, but regardless of whether the friendship continues to provide benefit, pleasure, stimulation, or even comfort. The well being wished for is unconnected, at its root, from the well being received. This is what gives virtue friendship its unconditional quality, not in the sense that the friendship survives any change whatsoever, but in the sense that the good wished for the friend is not contingent on the friend continuing to fulfill a particular function in one's life. Consider what this looks like in practice, not as an abstract achievement, but as a quality of daily attention. A person who loves their friend in this way notices in the ordinary course of time that their interest in the friend's flourishing extends beyond what directly benefits them. When the friend succeeds at something difficult, the pleasure felt is not diminished by the fact that the success belongs to the friend alone. When the friend struggles, the concern felt is not proportional to whether the struggle will have consequences for oneself. The friend's life is, in some genuine sense, a part of the territory one cares about, not because it has been consciously extended there, but because the caring grew there naturally. Over time, the way roots grow toward water. There is something in all of this that runs counter to a simpler picture of the self as a sealed unit, primarily concerned with its own maintenance. The picture Aristotle is offering is one in which the self, properly ordered and genuinely engaged with another person over time, is not sealed at all. Its boundaries are real. Each person remains themselves, with their own character, their own history, their own responsibilities. But those boundaries are also permeable in a specific way. The friend has come inside, not as an intrusion, but as a natural expansion. What was once outside the perimeter of what one cares about has shifted through time and attention and mutual witness to inside it. The self is larger for having genuinely included another person's good within its own. And in that enlarged form, the self is not diminished or weakened or dissolved. It is more fully itself, because part of what the self is in Aristotle's understanding is relational, is constituted by these bonds of mutual care and recognition that it cannot fully exist without. Aristotle took the same care with the question of friendships between people who are not equal, and it is worth pausing there for a moment, because the image of two perfectly matched individuals of identical virtue and circumstance is not the landscape most people actually inhabit. Most friendships involve some asymmetry in age, in wisdom, in circumstance, in the degree to which each person can offer what the other needs, between a teacher and a student, between an older person and a younger one, between someone established in the world and someone still finding their footing. Aristotle's view is that these relationships can be genuine friendships and can contain real warmth and goodwill, but that what each party gives and receives will be different in kind rather than identical. The older person may offer guidance, stability, a kind of witness across time. The younger may offer vitality, a willingness to question, an energy that keeps the older person from settling into the closed certainty of habit. Neither is giving what the other gives. Both are giving something real. What sustains these asymmetric friendships is not equality of exchange, but a kind of proportional understanding, each person knowing, without resentment, what the other can offer and what they cannot, and receiving what is offered for what it is, rather than measuring it against an expectation, it was never intended to meet. The relationship holds not because the two people are the same, but because each understands the shape of the difference between them and has made peace with it. There is, however, a limit to how far asymmetry can be stretched before the mutual recognition that friendship requires becomes impossible. Aristotle points at some distance to the extreme case, the relationship between a human being and something so much greater, a god, for instance, that the gap in nature and power is simply too vast for the mutual orientation friendship requires. At some point, the distance is not a difference to be proportionally accounted for, but a chasm across which genuine reciprocity cannot pass. This is not a despairing observation. It is a careful one, a clarification of what makes friendship friendship, by examining the point at which the conditions for it cannot be met. The afternoon at the Lyceum had continued to settle. The light on the colonnades had shifted from gold to something warmer and lower. A few students had returned to the walkways, moving slowly, not quite in conversation, the way people move at the end of a long day, when thinking and talking have used up their particular energies, and what remains is a quieter form of being together. Aristotle would have noticed them. He noticed most things. His philosophy was built from noticing, from the patient accumulation of observed particulars before any general claim was ventured. These students, walking in the cooling afternoon, thinking things through in the company of others who were thinking things through. They were, in their way, enacting something he had been trying to describe. Not perfectly, perhaps not even consciously, but the form was there. There is a final observation that belongs here, and it concerns not the structure of the argument, but something more elusive, the quality of improvement that genuine friendship tends to produce in the people inside it. In a relationship between people of matched virtue, each person tends, over time, to become somewhat better, more patient, more honest, more willing to be corrected without resentment. This is not the goal of the friendship. If it were consciously pursued as a goal, it would introduce a quality of instrumentalism that would undermine what makes the friendship what it is. It is not even in most cases noticed as it happens. It is a consequence rather than an aim, the way a plant that receives adequate water and light will grow upward, not because it has decided to, but because those are the conditions in which growth is possible. Being genuinely known and genuinely cared for over a long period of time by someone whose judgment one respects, this creates conditions in which growth becomes possible. The growth happens quietly, without announcement, in the ordinary texture of the days. What Aristotle observed is that each person becomes, in some sense, the keeper of the other's better self, not by managing or correcting, but simply by being there, by providing the continued presence of someone who sees clearly and cares genuinely, in whose company there is both the safety to be imperfect and the gentle pressure to be honest. The two people who have shared years in this way are not quite the same people who began. The friendship has not merely accompanied them through time, it has been, in the most patient and invisible way, one of the conditions under which they became who they are. In the golden and quieting light of the Lyceum's late afternoon, Aristotle set the stylus down across the tablet in his lap. The phrase he had been working toward, allos odos, was already on the surface of the wax, a few lines back. It sat there with the particular stillness of something that had found its form. Outside the colonnade, two of his students had stopped walking and stood together in the thinning light, one of them speaking and the other listening with the full attention of someone for whom what is being said matters, not because it is useful, not because it is entertaining, but because the person saying it matters, in that deep and structural way that takes years to build and that once built, becomes part of the invisible architecture of how one moves through the world. The self that has expanded in this way, that has genuinely included another person's good within its own, not through loss of its own contours, but through an honest and patient extension of what it is willing to care for. That self is not smaller for the inclusion. It is not less private, less intact, less fundamentally its own. It is, in a sense that is difficult to name, but easy to recognize, more whole. The solitude it returns to, at the end of the day, is a richer kind of solitude, populated not by the absence of others, but by the continued quiet presence of someone who has, over years of honest attention and mutual care, become part of the furniture of one's own inner life. Not a distraction from the self. One of the forms the self most fully takes, the agora at Athens in the hour before the traders arrive. The stones are still cool. The light that comes over the eastern hills is thin and flat, falling across the colonnades without yet warming them, and the columns cast long shadows that point westward, like arms reaching back toward the night. A few figures move at the edges of the open square: a water carrier, a man arranging cloth on a wooden frame, two older citizens who have arrived early for no apparent reason other than the pleasure of being present when the city is still gathering itself. They know each other. That much is visible without knowing their names or their histories. The ease between them, the particular way one turns toward the other when he speaks, the small nod that carries more meaning than a longer gesture would, all of it is legible to anyone watching, and yet its full content belongs only to them, built from years of shared mornings in this same square, the same light, the same gradually warming stones. Aristotle had watched scenes like this one. It is almost certain that he had stood at the edges of public spaces and noticed the texture of the human world, who moved easily among others, who stood apart, where the invisible lines of goodwill ran through a crowd and made it something other than a collection of separate people happening to occupy the same ground. His philosophy was empirical in its instincts. He trusted what could be observed, what could be seen in the ordinary movements of ordinary lives, and what he saw in a city where people genuinely knew one another was not merely efficiency or order, though a city with those qualities had both. What he saw was a particular quality of ease, the way that recognized faces and established trust, and accumulated small histories of mutual goodwill, made a shared space feel, to those moving through it, like something they could inhabit rather than merely use. He wrote, at the opening of his treatment of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, that philia is the thing most necessary for life, not a luxury, not an embellishment added to a life already complete in its other dimensions, not the warmth that a well-organized existence might permit itself once the harder requirements had been met. Necessary. The word sits there with its full weight, and it is worth staying with it long enough to feel what he meant. A life without bonds of genuine goodwill, a life spent among people who recognize one another only as obstacles or instruments or strangers, is not a diminished version of the good life. It is, in Aristotle's account, a life that has missed something constitutive, something without which the rest cannot be quite what it might have been. The city, too. He extended the claim from the individual to the political community and found the same thing waiting at that scale. Without philia, without the bonds of genuine goodwill moving through a city among its members, a political community becomes something else, a collection of people held together by law and the threat of consequence, sharing a boundary but not a life. Law can prevent people from injuring one another. It can distribute goods in ways that can be argued to be fair, what it cannot do by itself. is produce the thing Aristotle was pointing at when he noticed those two men in the agora turning toward each other in the early light. The quality of recognized particularity, the knowledge that this person is known by name and by character and by a shared history that goes back far enough to have accumulated weight. He put it with characteristic precision. When people are genuine friends, there is no additional need for justice between them, because a true friend already wishes the other well and acts accordingly. This is not a claim that friendship makes law unnecessary in a city or that goodwill alone can organize a complex society. It is something quieter and more specific. It is the observation that justice, at its best, is trying to produce something that friendship already is, a reliable orientation toward the other's good, expressed not as obligation, but as inclination, not as rule following, but as natural extension of a well-ordered care. The person who genuinely wishes their friend well does not need a rule telling them not to harm their friend's interests. The orientation is already there. The law would be, in that particular direction, redundant. This is where Aristotle's account of friendship opens outward, from the intimate and the personal into something that has the shape of a political philosophy. The two men in the agora, turning toward each other in the early light, are not merely illustrating a warm human fact. They are, in their small and ordinary way, holding a city together, not through any grand act of civic virtue, not through sacrifice or public service, or anything that would make its way into official accounts of how a community is sustained. Simply through the accumulated weight of mutual recognition, of goodwill that has been proven reliable across enough instances that it has become a kind of invisible infrastructure, the thing that makes the stones of the agora feel, to those walking across them, like ground that belongs to them. Aristotle gave this civic dimension a name. He called it homonoia, a word that sits between concord and like-mindedness, that points at the quality of shared orientation toward the common good, that he took to be the political analog to personal virtue friendship. Homonoia is not the warm, particular bond between two people who have shared years and salt and the slow accumulation of tested trust. It is something broader and correspondingly thinner, the kind of mutual goodwill that can exist among citizens who are not intimate friends, who do not know each other's private histories, who will never sit together at the end of a long day with the ease that belongs only to people who have long since stopped needing to demonstrate themselves to each other. But it is goodwill nonetheless, oriented toward a shared life and expressed in cooperative action, and the kind of trust that makes a city feel, to those living in it, like something worth inhabiting. When that is present, when the citizens of a polis share not merely its geography, but a genuine orientation toward one another's good, a felt sense that the community is something they hold in common, and not merely something they happen to be contained by. Aristotle thought the city was, in the relevant sense, working, not perfectly, not without conflict or difficulty, or the ordinary frictions of people with different interests, sharing a limited space, but working in the deeper sense, producing the conditions under which human nature can exercise its characteristic excellences, under which the life that a person is capable of living can actually be lived. His disagreement with Plato on this point was patient and direct. Plato had proposed, in the Republic, that the guardian class of his ideal city should hold all things in common, no private property, no particular family attachments, the children raised collectively so that no parent could claim a child as especially their own, and no child could claim a parent. The intention was to eliminate the corruption that comes from private interest, the way that attachment to what is mine and mine alone tends to pull people away from what is ours and genuinely shared. Plato wanted a city in which the private had been dissolved into the common, and in which the loyalties that usually attach to particular others had been redistributed evenly across all. Aristotle looked at this proposal and found it wanting, not from sentiment, but from a philosophical conviction about how care actually works. He argued that a city in which everything is held in common and no one has special attachments to particular others will not produce stronger civic feeling. It will produce weaker civic feeling, a diluted and shallow solidarity that has the form of universal concern without the substance of genuine care. The person who can say of all the city's children that they are each equally mine will, Aristotle suspected, love each of them with something closer to indifference than to the love a parent feels for a particular child. The thing that makes care intense, reliable, and genuinely responsive to the person in front of you is precisely the particularity of the attachment, the fact that this person, and not a general category of persons, is the one toward whom the care is directed. There is something in this argument that carries forward into the texture of ordinary life in ways Aristotle himself may not have fully traced. The city that tries to make all bonds equal tends to make all bonds thin. The friendship that tries to extend itself equally to everyone tends to extend itself honestly to almost no one. Care has a kind of concentration that resists perfect distribution. What Aristotle was defending in his critique of Plato was the particular, the specific face, the known character, the accumulated history of a specific shared life as the irreducible unit of genuine goodwill. The universal can be gestured at, aspired to, worked toward in political structures and laws, and the careful arrangement of shared institutions. But the thing that makes a city feel inhabited, that makes its spaces feel like ground rather than territory, is the sum of its particular recognitions, the accumulated weight of its ordinary daily goodwills. Centuries passed. The Lyceum eventually closed. Athens changed in ways that Aristotle had not imagined and would perhaps not have recognized. The polis, as a form of human organization, gave way to empires and then to other forms, each with their own ways of organizing the question of what people owe one another and how a shared life is possible. But the arguments Aristotle had made did not simply end when the institution that had housed them was dissolved. They entered the long conversation that philosophy conducts with itself across time, finding new voices and new contexts and new occasions for being returned to, the way that a question one has set down and walked away from sometimes returns in a different light and asks to be considered again. Cicero, in Rome, in the year 44 BCE, was an old man who had recently lost his daughter and was about to lose, in a more violent way, a great deal else. He sat down to write a dialogue about friendship, speaking in the voice of the statesman Laetius, who had watched his closest friend Scipio die years before and had been living ever since inside the long aftermath of that loss. The dialogue he produced, the De Amicitia, reaches back explicitly to Aristotle's account, though Cicero renders it in the language and register of Roman public life, translating the Greek philia into the Latin amicitia, and finding in the translation something that fits the particular shape of Roman civic virtue. What Lullius says about Scipio, looking back across the years of their shared life, would not have surprised Aristotle. The argument is familiar. True friendship is grounded in virtue, sustains itself through time and difficulty, and cannot be dissolved by changes in circumstance or advantage because it is not organized around circumstance or advantage to begin with. What is different in Cicero's rendering is the quality of grief that moves through it. Laelius is not lecturing about the nature of friendship in the abstract. He is describing from the inside what it is to have had a particular friendship and to be living in the world that exists after it. The philosophy does not change, but it arrives in a different key, the key of someone who has lived inside this account long enough to know what it costs, what it gives, what the world looks like when the person who was, in every meaningful sense, another self, is no longer present in it. The arguments Aristotle made in the calm afternoon light of the Lyceum arrive in Cicero's dialogue, filtered through something more personal, and they do not lose their force in the filtering. They gain a kind of weight that pure argument, for all its clarity, cannot quite supply on its own. The tradition continued moving. Montaigne, in the 16th century, sat in his tower in Perigord and wrote essays in which philosophy and autobiography were so thoroughly interwoven that it sometimes becomes impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. He had had a friendship with Etienne de la Boétie, who died young, that had marked him in ways he spent the rest of his life trying to understand. When he tried to explain what had made that friendship what it was, he found that the full resources of his considerable philosophical education were not quite equal to the task. Not because the friendship was beyond analysis, but because the analysis, however careful and precise, kept pointing at something that the analysis itself could not contain. He finally settled on a sentence that is less an explanation than a gesture toward the thing that explanation cannot reach. Because it was him, because it was me. The sentence has been read as a failure of analysis. It is more honestly a recognition that some things are more precisely described by pointing than by explaining, that there are forms of particularity so specific, attachments so rooted in the unrepeatable coincidence of two particular characters finding each other in a particular moment, that the attempt to give a more general account would be in the relevant sense false. Aristotle would have recognized this. His account of virtue friendship is grounded precisely in the recognition that the bond is between these two people, with their specific characters and their specific shared history, and that the philosophical account of what makes such a bond possible does not replace or dissolve the particularity. It simply describes the conditions under which the particularity can take root and grow into something durable. C.S. Lewis in the 20th century wrote a book called The Four Loves, in which he gave his own account of friendship's distinctive character, and the account has a family resemblance to Aristotle's that is not accidental. Lewis described friendship as arising between people who discover in each other a shared vision, a shared sense of what matters, what is worth caring about, what the world is like when looked at honestly. The moment of its beginning is, in his account, a moment of recognition, expressed in the simplest possible terms. What, you too? The discovery that another person sees what one sees, cares about what one cares about, finds significant what one finds significant. This is, in Lewis's account, the opening of something that has the potential to become a genuine friendship, as distinct from the pleasantness of general company or the warmth of mutual benefit. The account echoes Aristotle's without repeating it exactly. Both are pointing at something that begins in recognition, not the recognition of a useful partner or an entertaining companion, though friendships of both kinds have their genuine worth, but the recognition of a character, a way of being in the world, that corresponds in some deep way to one's own. The difference between Aristotle's formulation and Lewis's is partly one of emphasis. Aristotle grounds the recognition in shared virtue, in the mutual perception of each other's stable good character, while Lewis frames it more expansively as a shared vision, a common way of seeing. But both are pointing at the same kind of event, the moment when what passes between two people becomes something more than the exchange of pleasantness or advantage, when the encounter touches something in each of them that is more settled and more particular than taste or mood or the desire for good company. It is a long way from the colonnades of the Lyceum to a 16th century tower in Perigord, or to an Oxford study in the 20th century, or to the quiet of wherever a person might sit at the end of an ordinary evening, holding still for a moment before sleep. And yet the argument that Aristotle set out in his examination of philia has traveled all of that distance without losing its essential shape. What it describes, the distinction between relationships organized around what each person can get from the other, and the rarer relationship organized around who each person is, does not depend on the specific social arrangements of 4th century Athens for its force. The agora changes, the city changes, the particular forms that public life takes, and the specific ways that friendship is embedded in civic arrangements shift across centuries and cultures in ways that Aristotle could not have anticipated. But the underlying observation that there are different depths at which human connection can be rooted, and that the depth matters, seems to remain recognizable to each era that has returned to it, each finding in it a vocabulary for something it was already trying to describe. There is a kind of quiet available to someone who has sat with these distinctions long enough to carry them lightly, not the quiet of having resolved the question of what genuine friendship is, what it requires, how rare it is, whether one has it or might find it, or has passed it by without recognizing it, is not the kind of question that resolves cleanly. It remains open in the way that most of the questions philosophy reaches toward remain open, not because the thinking has been insufficient, but because the thing being thought about is real and complex and does not simplify obligingly for the convenience of a clean answer. The quiet available after long acquaintance with Aristotle's account of philia is more like the quiet of having been given a vocabulary that fits, a set of distinctions that correspond to something actually present in the texture of lived experience, that allow one to see more precisely what was always there. A person sitting at the end of an evening, setting down whatever the day has given them, might find themselves turning over those distinctions without urgency, without the pressure of needing to arrive at a verdict, thinking about which of the many connections that fill a life are organized around what each person offers the other, the colleague whose goodwill is genuine, and whose company is pleasant, and whose continued presence in one's life depends on continued shared circumstance, and recognizing in it this not a reproach, but simply an honest description of what that warmth is and what it is not. Thinking about the friendships organized around pleasure and vitality, the people whose company makes evenings feel alive, whose wit and energy are a genuine gift, and recognizing in those friendships their own kind of worth, real, particular, genuinely warm, without needing to claim for them a depth they have not yet reached or may never reach. Thinking about the one or two connections, if they exist, or what has built up over years of shared time, honest attention, and the slow consumption of all that salt, begins to resemble the thing Aristotle was pointing at, where the question of what one gets from the friendship has receded so far into the background that it no longer feels like a relevant frame. Aristotle thought such friendships were rare. He said so directly, and with the calm of someone reporting an observed fact rather than delivering a melancholy verdict. The conditions they require are simply demanding, matched virtue, or something close to it, which means both people must have developed something like a stable and well-ordered character, enough shared time for genuine knowledge of each other to replace first impressions, and the particular willingness to love the other for what the other actually is, rather than for what the relationship provides. Most lives will contain more of the other kinds, and this is not a failure. The other kinds are genuine instances of friendship. They contain real goodwill, real warmth, real forms of mutual recognition that are worth having and worth tending. Aristotle treated them with the same careful attention he brought to everything he examined. A physician's attention, one might say, directed at a condition that is real and worth understanding, even if it is not the fullest expression of what the condition can be. The virtue friendship, when it is present, contains the other forms within it rather than dismissing them. People of matched and settled character still enjoy each other's company. They are still, in the simplest and most ordinary sense, pleasant to be around. They still provide each other with the countless small practical goods that flow through any close connection: information, support, the texture of being known that makes the difficult things easier and the good things richer. But these things are not what the friendship is organized around. They are consequences of it, the natural overflow of a bond that is rooted in something more stable than benefit or pleasure or the coincidence of shared circumstance. The friendship contains them the way that a tree contains its shade, not as its purpose, but as what its presence naturally produces. The city at dawn, the stones warming slowly as the light comes in from the east. The two citizens who have arrived early moving through the open square with the ease of people who have been coming to this place for many years, who have greeted each other across enough ordinary mornings that the greeting has accumulated a weight it could not have had in the beginning. They are not, perhaps, friends in the fullest sense Aristotle described. Perhaps they are, and the depth of it is simply not visible from this distance. What is visible is the goodwill, the mutual recognition, the small and daily orientation of each toward the other that makes the square feel, in however modest a way, like a shared space rather than neutral ground. Aristotle's claim that philia is the most necessary thing for life was made in this world and about this world, about the texture of actual cities and actual lives. The observable fact that human beings do not flourish in isolation and do not produce their characteristic excellences without the sustained presence of others who know them, challenge them, wish them well, and occasionally, in the honest and caring way of people who have nothing to gain from flattery, tell them something true about themselves that they had not been able to see. The philosophy grew from observation of the human world as it was actually lived, and it pointed back toward that world with the precision of someone who has looked at something long enough to see it clearly. What it offers, taken quietly and without urgency, is not a program for improving one's social life or a set of criteria for evaluating existing relationships. It is something more like a lamp held steadily in a large room. The room does not change, but what is already present in it becomes visible in a different way. The person of genuine goodwill, the relationship built over years on the ground of honest mutual regard, the moment when two people discover they are looking at the same thing and find in each other not merely pleasant company, but something more like recognition. These were present before the philosophy named them, and they will continue to be present in whatever forms they take as the centuries continue to change the landscape in which human beings find and lose and build and tend their bonds with one another. The agora has been quiet for a long time now. The particular colonnades where those 4th century citizens moved and greeted one another by name, carrying their visible histories of alliance and trust and mutual regard, are ruins or memory or both. The Lyceum is gone. The long afternoons of walking and thinking and talking that Aristotle shared with his students, the particular community of inquiry that was itself a kind of living example of what he was trying to describe, dissolved long ago into the general flow of time that takes everything eventually into distance. What remains is the argument, patient, careful, grounded in observation, and still recognizable to anyone who has ever sat with another person in the particular quiet, that belongs only to people who have shared enough time that silence itself has become a form of companionship. The argument that the bond between two people who see each other clearly and wish each other well, for no other reason than that is who they are to each other, is not an ornament to a life, but one of its necessary forms. That the self which has genuinely included another person's good within its own is not a smaller self for the including, but in some sense larger, more settled, more fully present, more capable of the kind of honesty and care that makes a life feel inhabited rather than merely endured. The questions Aristotle asked are still open in the ways they were always open. What does it mean to know another person well enough to love them for what they actually are rather than what they appear to be?